I think to start, I just want to, really express that this is really, this is Christ's story. It's a reflection of, you know, his story in an individual, human life, which he desires for all of us, right? So as you know from my story, I've been a victim of sexual abuse, specifically within the setting of a parish. I think one of the aspects of my story that is particularly striking would be that for me in my personal reflections and is that so we see the sexual abuse crisis in the church, right? It's talked about ad nauseum by the media. A lot of people have used that as an excuse to leave. One of the things I've come to really realize over the course of my healing journey is that there were so many factors that led up to the vulnerability that I had, and really, in a sense, pushed me into that situation. I think even more so having to do with the destruction of the family unit, which I have also been a victim of in a lot of ways. But I'll start by just maybe kind of giving you a little history prior of what led up to the abuse, and really, yeah, what the dispositions I had. I think that really made me just put me in that position to be used, right? So growing up, right, I came from a really Catholic household. On the outside, we were, very involved in our parish. I'm an only child. There was probably around the time of my first communion, my dad put me in altar serving. Prior to that point, I remember as a kid, not really having much interest in going to mass. Just typical, child wanting to play, falling asleep, being bored. Something about learning about the Eucharist and receiving Him for the first time, completely, from a young age, I remember just feeling a definite call that changed my whole outlook. Like church was the only place I wanted to be, right? And altar serving, had a lot to do with that. So as I said, right, I came from a seemingly really good Catholic family. There were a lot of problems at home, specifically, with the relationship my parents had. I really, yeah, from those relationships, I think specifically within my family, I kind of saw myself as a really an object, of use, or kind of someone who had to take care of things, right? Rather than letting myself, be a child and being taken care of in that way. So that's a very important factor that played into a lot of this. At the age of 12, so in our church community, we had a good relationship with a particular family, and I grew really close to a older boy who was about 3 or 4 years older than me. And I had an instance basically of sexual trauma from that relationship. I was 12 years old at the time. And because of the dynamics that I previously described in my family life, I felt like I had no one to turn to, right? When I experienced a lot of pain from that incident. I lost a relationship. I felt just so much internal shame, like I had done something wrong. When I look back in hindsight, I was a 12-year-old, he was 16. I was really a child, right? And just trying to figure things out. And because of, where I was in my faith life at the time as well, I desired, genuinely to live out my faith, and avoid, those types of sins specifically. But I fell into this really deep despair, which I can really now identify as depression. Really, it was a response to the trauma that had occurred, but it was twisted with this really this just dark pride that kind of seeped in, like it was my fault, and there was no way to really give it outward. It was all internal. Care, right? So that played a huge part. By the grace of God, I was at the point, I think, as a 12, 13-year-old, because of that experience where I was I was contemplating suicide. I was, practicing self-harm. I remember going to the confessional one day, and all of a sudden it just became, abundantly clear. I was looking at the crucifix, and I just had this thought pop into my head that he, on that crucifix, knew everything that was going to happen before he did that, right? And that alone, by the grace of the sacrament, no doubt, it really pulled me out of that, the low point that I was at the time. Not completely. There was, of course, external factors, the environment that were not, changed, specifically within my home life. So I didn't have, that chance to really heal from my human needs. But I did get a sense of that spiritual grace, which would come back later. So moving forward, 2 years after that experience, my parents essentially, it was probably like a month into starting high school, they went through a horrible, very public, nasty divorce that essentially put me back into that place. I was, because of the nature of the divorce and just, I think, divorce in general, I felt like a piece of property, right? And that theme of just, being an object of use and someone who had to take care of things really came back. Because of their divorce, I also developed a relationship with our pastor, as well as a church secretary at the time, who, during those times, they were really the only two people I trusted. They became, like my second mom and dad, in a sense. And they were very important to me. And I, essentially idolized both of them as a teenager. And, my parish at that time was really the only place I had a sense of stability, right? It was my home. Just prior to my parents' divorce, I met a man. So he was at the time, a liturgical assistant for the bishop of my home diocese. Lay person. He, immediately kind of showed an odd interest in me. And as my time at the church increased, coincidentally or perhaps intentionally, I remember seeing him coming around a lot. And he became particularly close with my pastor, who I was very close with at the time. I made him my confirmation sponsor. I really considered him a confidant, right? And my pastor idolized this man, completely. So essentially I came to do the same, right? Around the time, so it was about 2 years after, a year or two after my parents' divorce, this man started messaging me on social media, right? And at first that was a little odd, but there was nothing, explicitly, wrong about it. And this would continue for a while, right? So eventually it kind of progressed into there were things that were being said, that they were not explicit, and it wasn't quite clear, but it was something that was developing an emotional attachment. And there were certain suggestive things that if I had brought them to the pastor or if I had talked about, I knew it wasn't clear enough to actually make an accusation, right? At the same time, amidst all of this, right, I'm a 16-year-old kid, really just feeling a lot of wounds from the nature of my parents' relationship, just the publicity that their divorce got within our community, and feeling like I couldn't trust anyone, right? So this man, who my pastor idolizes, giving me, this outpouring of attention, emotionally I grasped onto it. And I remember, initially, thinking like, I'm stupid not to say something about this. But then there became a sense of, why am I letting this go? There's somebody's, noticing me, someone's, there for me, right? So I kept it, pretty much, it was the thing in my life that I was hiding, it was my thing that no one could take away, in a sense. Right. And at the time, right, coming from kind of out of that space where I was, dealing with a prior sexual trauma, that there was a lot still, unresolved from that. that I was also dealing with and struggling with chastity, right, and other relationships as a teenager. So as I had mentioned, right, this man, he started, coming around a lot more, and there was, over time, it was very subtle, a clear intention for an explicit relationship, right? By the time it became explicit, I was emotionally invested, emotionally attached to this person. I wanted to be free of it, but I couldn't let go, right? For the most part, thankfully, the entirety of the relationship was virtual. However, 2 days after my 18th birthday, it became a physical relationship. And at that time, I remember, the next morning after what happened, just feeling like completely embarrassed. Like I couldn't tell any of my other teenage friends. There were one or two I remember who knew, something was weird about, who I was messaging all the time, and I had confided in one or two of them. I remember saying that I don't know what to do in this situation, but the answer I got from all of them was, you should tell your dad. And there's no way I was going to do that at the time, because my dad was incredibly stressed at this point. I was living with him. He was a single father. I was going to school, 40 minutes away from where we lived, and he was going to work 40 minutes the opposite direction, right? So we were incredibly stressed out, right? Yeah, so I held on to this, this huge secret for a while. After the physical incident occurred, and even there were a couple times before that where I tried to cease communication with him, but he essentially, a month would go by and he would come back, and the process would start all over again, right? So the fall of my freshman year of college was really when I made a kind of a firm, a firmer, you need to leave me alone. I don't want this. That lasted for 2 months. And as I was, adjusting to life in college, I began to explore some pretty hedonistic ways of living for a little bit. Just, excessive drinking, really just trying to fill that void at the same time, going to activities with my Newman Center, and getting involved with focus missionaries and Catholic women's studies, which is something that I had never really experienced before. And it was really so at the end of my fall semester of college, I was at a point where the unchaste and the secular relationships that I was pursuing with my peers were killing me, and I could really feel that emotionally and spiritually. But thank God I had this other community, right, who was pointing me towards virtue. And I felt, actually had a genuine compassion for me as a human being, right? It wasn't a relationship of use. It was just accompaniment. And that's exactly what I needed. So I remember that, so over that Christmas break, going to a conference, and there was a big hall of just Catholic University students in adoration. And for the first time, I remember really feeling, I was staring at the Eucharist and just having in a sense, a vision almost of Christ actually sacrificing in his totality, even his body for me. And being someone who had, I think, a lot of sexual wounds, I just broke down in tears and my heart just sunk. And there was a real encounter that occurred. So leaving that conference and coming back to my campus that next semester, about a month in, after, doing a lot of personal reflection, I ended up confiding in one of the person who's I consider still my best friend today. She was a fellow student, freshman. I could feel, her compassion, and she was so rooted in Christ that I told her everything that occurred. I mean, it was really from that sharing that I ended up, essentially, I sent my, abuser a long message telling him this is over for good. What you did was wrong. I was a child, you know. And I was completely resolute in that. And there was so much freedom, but at the same time, I was really grieving that attachment. I remember, you know, as I mentioned, I have a blog that talks about this, but there was a tangible feeling of a feeling as if my soul was torn in a sense. And I now understand that on a theological level because of, you know, the experiences that I had with that person. There was a clear, you know, spiritual attachment that occurred. And it was really also on top of, you know, the compassion I had received from that friend who directed me towards our Blessed Mother. It was an encounter with her as well that led me to really pour all of this out eventually to Christ. And this was so after this, I was kind of in I'd say about a 10-month, 9-month discernment period of how to navigate the situation further, realizing, you know, the gravity of what had occurred, the potential need, you know, to protect members of my parish. So I was actually going to spiritual direction for a little bit to talk about this issue. And at the same time, I remember over the summer, there were a couple times where I had actually ran into this man at the church. That was it was obviously an odd experience. He you know, pretended as if nothing obviously was happening because he had to. He was in front of a lot of people. I noticed at the same time, right around the time I had completely, you know, stopped communication with my pastor, or I'm sorry, stopped communication with that man, my pastor started treating me differently. I didn't quite understand it. There was an attitude of suspicion towards me just in general, right? And there was less friendliness. So I have kind of reasonable, I guess, evidence to kind of assume that that man was probably saying things to my pastor to either, you know, give me a bad face or, unfortunately, there's a possibility my pastor even knew what was happening. And I don't know for sure, but it's a thought that, you know, has popped into my head continuously. Yeah, and so there's this weird limbo period, as I said, where I'm just, you know, I was discerning, what do I do, and who do I submit control to, right, in the situation, right? Who needs to know? One of the biggest issues for me was realizing that if I did become public about this, how it would look on the church. So around January of so my sophomore year of college, I was at, again, essentially the same conference that I had a prior experience with the year before with seeing Christ's body. There was I can't remember exactly the topic of the talk, but a well-known Catholic sister was talking about essentially the necessity of, or really the profoundness of, our Lord as a loving Father, right? And that night we had the opportunity to go confession, and I was placed actually with a priest from the Diocese of Pittsburgh who years later I would again meet, but I ended up doing a general confession that night, telling him everything, and he stopped me in the middle confession and said, I want to talk to you about this after if you're open. So I did, and we spent probably the majority of the conference talking through the situation, and he encouraged me to file a report. So from Dallas, Texas, I ended up calling my dad, I believe the next night, to tell him everything that occurred. And the response I got immediately was exactly that of a loving father, right? I wasn't expecting, but then I flew home. And my father was, of course, you know, processing his own emotions with the situation, and he, you know, has apologized to me since, but his response was very angry and very very harsh when I got home initially. Yeah. And we've had some very good talks about it since he's grown in understanding, and you know, I've also grown as well too. So it's but there are wounds from that, definitely that conversation that still, you know, pop up. now and then. But then it came time to, meet with a diocesan rep, right? She was absolutely amazing. She saw, the messages, she listened to my story. She encouraged me to file a police report and actually sat with me as I had to go over everything with the policeman. She was just honestly a reflection of our Blessed Mother to me at that time. The one person, I'd hoped that would be there for me, but I had a feeling would not be, was my pastor, who I was very close with. I remember coming forward with the information, and something that really strikes me to this day was I remember looking at his face and he wasn't surprised about anything I said. And his initial response was, "Why did the diocese have to know? You were 18 when the physical relationship happened." And that was really obviously hard to hear. I should have at that point, looking back in hindsight, stepped back and just not put myself in his presence, right? And potentially, gone to another church. But there was this weird period where, the police report was, up in the air. I was trying not to lose my sense of home, at that church as well. And at the same time, my dad, I think, was going through something similar, even though I didn't understand it. I remember there were a lot of instances where I was hearing that, so the man that did all of this, right, he lived about an hour away, right? There were closer churches, but he was still coming and being very public. And we had asked, the pastor, like, hey, this happened, can you, like, not have him around, in a public setting, right? It's kind of disrespectful. But the answer was, constantly no. And they seemed like they were closer than ever, right? And there was a long time, probably about a year, where I was really grasping after Father's, love and understanding. I had a lot of conversations with him. I wrote him letters, but I was just hitting a wall each time. And I recognize now that it's, maybe I needed to do that at the time. But in a sense, I was looking for something that God the Father had already given me, right? So that's and since then, right, it's really been a long period of growing in, I think, relationship with God through people who have been really rooted in his love in a way that those people were not, right? So I shortly after this, I met my husband, or the man who's now my husband, right? And we at the college I went to, a priest I knew growing up, who I always had a very good relationship with and just a fondness over, was stationed actually very close to my university, right? So it's he was really putting people in my life to set me up to move forward from all of this.
Mariah, this is an incredible story. If I could ask a particular question, you mentioned about your soul being torn. I think that's the word that you use, from the sexual trauma.
Yeah.
And I hear that quite a bit. And it's true, there is a tearing, or some people will say that there's pieces of you that are missing emotionally or spiritually. So how did you deal with that torn, missing parts of yourself that were traumatized? What has been the path for you to deal with that particular part of yourself that you feel that's been damaged?
Yeah. Honestly, Deacon, it's still, a lifelong process. I think the biggest thing for me, especially initially when it was just really raw, was going to adoration every day. I feel almost it was as if, there was kind of a mystery in how I was being healed. But simply sitting in front of the sacrament, looking back in hindsight, I remember just seeing so much growth in how that pain was being dealt with. I think on a practical level, really being persistent in a life of virtue, as the church teaches. Of course, it lets grace in, right? And it allows us, I think, to just experience his healing love in a way that, we could never recover on our own. And ultimately, it's been a journey of placing myself intentionally in situations that are conducive to his love, right? So I began pursuing, my dating relationships with people who I knew wanted chastity, wanted to be saints ultimately. Um, and that the love I've received from those people built me back up in a lot of ways.
Wow. So with your wounds, because I know you talk about the crucifix, and of course you look at Jesus being wounded, and then of course you have for him back then when he was hung on the cross, most likely he was hung naked. So there's that physical shame, that comes. So in your journey, how do you relate to Christ and his suffering and his woundedness? How does that speak to you? And then from that, how do you see healing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like obviously, the suffering of Christ it's all encompassing, it's so complex. I think in a lot of ways, because of what I've experienced, specifically from my former pastor, so to someone who's, I think, silently suffering with something like this, I would want to say, there's a couple things. First, be patient with yourself. Um, I think even before that, though, recognize that what you're feeling, that shame, that hurt, and that, even maybe that desire for love from your perpetrator, um, it's normal, right? You're a human, and it's an expression of that, right? It's a sign that something is off. Um, and more than likely, it's not within you. It's by what the actions communicated towards you from the perpetrator. And you're worth a lot more than that, right? Um, and as you begin your healing journey, there's probably going to be things that pop up unrelated, or you think are unrelated to the abuse that you remember or that you're hurt with, but just be patient with working through those things. And I think above all, don't do it alone. You may feel, like a burden, like who would want to, hear all of this from me, but you're not.
Right.
You need to have community in this.
What are some thoughts that a person that's been traumatized has to deal with? Because I know a lot of the assault is probably mental and the lies. So what lies did you have to deal with and counter with truth? And how did you deal with the thoughts that would go through your mind as you were going through recovery?
Yeah. Again, similar to I think a previous question you asked, it's an ongoing process. I've noticed at different stages of life, different lies will pop up.
Right.
I think one of the lies that I really had to struggle with was core beliefs related to I think me believing I didn't deserve love. Um, it makes sense, looking back through my childhood and some of the experiences I had there. And it was really compounded by the experiences of sexual trauma. But it took me a long time to figure out that I would catch myself, reacting to things such as, maybe a friend would be late for meeting for coffee, and I would automatically go to something like, this person doesn't love me, I'm not worth it, and it would make me really angry. And that anger was really coming from, I know now, a sense of what I was believing was in conflict with what was true, right? And it was that I was beloved, which I didn't believe, right?
Wow, that's great insight, and you're right. It's for some of us, for some people, it's a lifelong journey. It's a lifelong journey. So, anything else that you would like to say to that person that may be still secretly struggling, or anything else that you may want to share and relate to your topic?
Yeah, I think one of the most difficult things for me was having to, once I began this healing journey, I think one of the bad things I did was really do everything in my power to suppress feelings of love and feelings of fondness towards my abuser, because the realizing logically, the horrendousness of the situation, and feeling like those feelings of, I guess, fondness pointed to the fact that it was my fault when it wasn't, right? It was a natural human response to what had happened to me as, a minor. Um, I think letting yourself in a prudent way, and it's very difficult, letting yourself recognize those feelings is very important, because if they're repressed, they're not going anywhere, right?
Right.
They're staying within you, and they're going to come out. They're going to find a way. Oftentimes, at the moments that are least, I think suitable for actually processing them. So I think it's important to realize that even if you did feel, love or what you thought was love towards the person who hurt you, it wasn't your fault.
And so, and I know we have a few more minutes left. So what are some things that you do today to care for yourself, to nurture for yourself? 'Cause it sounds like loving yourself and experiencing love is important. So what are some things you do practically today to continue on your own self-love and self-nurture?
Yeah. Honestly, I still fail on that a lot, but I think really taking care of my spiritual life is something that I've had to really put to the forefront. Um, one of the struggles I've had personally with just the traumatic memories is the traumatic memories and what they elicit, from my humanity, and having to really fight that with virtue, and with prudence, right? So I've gone through some spiritual warfare type, a little bit of training in that, just to ensure that I'm recognizing I'm not doing this alone, right? God's not leaving me alone to deal with those memories. Also, I'm in therapy at least once a month. I speak to a counselor, just to check in and to make sure nothing's really looming. I think as a parent, a new mom, relatively new wife too. I've been married only 3 years. Those all of those things kind of they bring out different elements of the trauma at times. So it's important to if you're feeling overwhelmed, or you're feeling like something is coming up that seems kind of extreme or unrelated to a problem you and your spouse are facing, or the way you're reacting to your child, to take a step back with that and talk to someone. So that's something I've had to do.